Hello everybody, this is Andrew Connell. I am here to talk to you today on behalf of Lightning Tools about some announcements that we had from Ignite. And so this is primarily going to be for developers. Sorry we get started just a little bit late here. We had I've had a little bit of technical difficulties where all of a sudden my machine didn't want to log in for me, and then it didn't want to present the slides and all that stuff. So I'm now trying to go through and just frantically get a few more things set up really quick, so I apologize for a bit of the delay here. But so today, yeah, if you were not at the Microsoft conference at Ignite or earlier in September, or if you had not had a chance to catch up on everything that was announced, what I've done is I've taken some of the stuff from the SharePoint conference or from the Microsoft Ignite conference that they talked about with respect to the SharePoint framework. And I'm going to just kind of run through some of these things that they've added or that they're talking about adding and what the status of it is and all that stuff. So some of these slides, if you've already watched all the sessions from Ignite or you were in the room with Dan Kogan's session, some of this is going to look a little familiar to you, but we will kind of add on some stuff that I'll add on some things of some stuff that's changed or some news that's happened since Ignite as well. So before we get started here, let me just introduce myself real quick. Again, I want to thank Lightning Tools for hosting this webinar today and giving me a chance to talk to you guys about what's new at the SharePoint framework. My name is Andrew Connell. I'm an MVP for Office servers and services and Office development. I've been doing SharePoint development now for, oh my goodness, I think it's somewhere around like 13 or 14 or actually, well, I think it's almost 15 years, since 2003. I also have a podcast that I co-host called the Microsoft Cloud Show. You can see some information about that there on the screen, where we do weekly episodes on stuff related to Office 365, Azure, and the competitive landscape. And then I also have a training business called Voitanos that you can learn about there, where I've got a SharePoint framework developer video-based training course. I've got a couple of free resources here that I'll give you too in just a second. But before we start really getting into this, one of the things that Brett and I have set up here, or that Lightning Tools, Brett at Lightning Tools and I have set up, is that I'm gonna set it up so that I can actually answer questions. That's the part that I was trying to frantically set up here when we were starting the webinar. I was trying to get my iPad set up with Skype up so that he can send me the questions, as all of a sudden PowerPoint's taken over my screens and GoToMeeting wouldn't let me see Skype anymore. But there's two ways you can do this. One way is you can raise your hand in the webinar to let Brett know that you have a question you want to ask, and at a certain point during the webinar, he'll touch base with me, and then we'll unmute you so you can ask your question. The way that I would love to do it, or I would prefer to do it, I guess, is if you would tweet your question to and use the hashtag LTSPFX for Lightning Tools SharePoint Framework. That'll give us a way I can see the text and see things that are coming, and also kind of hopefully address multiple questions. Maybe people have the same question addressed multiple times, or just one time instead of having to go over it multiple times. Just real quick, I'll show you this too at the end here, but I just want to let you know that I do have a couple free resources related to the SharePoint framework. Maybe you're new to the SharePoint framework and you want to understand what the developer tool chain is all about, or maybe you just want to kind of get into getting started with it. I've got a couple free resources there that you can take a look at. But I've also we'll talk a lot about it in the webinar today, but I have some additional information that if I don't get to it, I just want to give you another resource. I have a blog post that I put up the week following the Ignite conference called the Uber SharePoint Framework Ignite 2017 Wrap-Up. And that's that link right there you see there in the middle of the page. What that'll do is that talks about a lot of the stuff that we're going to address today, but it also is going to cover a lot of the stuff that, some things that we may not get a chance to get to. Okay, so let's kind of dive into this. Now, first and foremost, I wanted to show you this screen. This is something that, now, it's kind of strange because I haven't seen this yet in my tenants. Gotta love, working in a case like Office 365 and SharePoint, where stuff gets rolled out and sometimes it gets in your tenant, sometimes it takes a little bit longer to get to your tenant. This is the new experience for adding things to a page in the modern experience. So we call this the toolbox. What this is that when I click that little plus icon inside of a page, what this will do is this will open up this big dialog that you see here, where I can add a bunch of additional stuff. So it's a much bigger toolbox. I can search for things by name. I can also group things alphabetically, and it not only is going to show me all of the different web parts that are available, but you'll notice there's a lot of stuff in there that isn't really a web part. What those are is, if you're familiar with some of the connectors that we have with Office 365 groups and with Teams and such, a lot of these connectors are going to show up inside of this option where we'll be able to add these straight to our page. So you see things like Trello, you see things like GitHub and Bitbucket, or Jira, or even a webhook you see there. All those things, which that one I'm a little confused on how that would work in a SharePoint page. But you'll see that we'll have a lot more controls of being able to add stuff to the page. Now, they didn't say when this was going to be available. I was under the impression that this was available now, but it's not showing up in my tenants. And so, of course, you may have it in yours. I don't have it in mine, but I just wanted to let you know that this is coming, or it may already be there for you, and I'm just in the dark on it. So this is a new piece that's coming. It's not so much a developer thing. Now, let me talk about 2 or 3 things that were announced, and since they've been announced at Ignite, they actually are now available to us to play with. Some of these things are in preview. Some of these things are generally available now. So the first one is something called Tenant Properties. So before I explain what this is, let's just think about a scenario when you'd want these. Have you ever had something like a setting on one of your web parts that you've built? So you're a developer, you've had some sort of a setting that maybe you need to point to some endpoint to go get some data. Like maybe you have a weather service to do the proverbial weather web part that we've all ended up building. You may have a URL that you embed in the web part, but maybe you want to give people the option to use different URLs. But you don't want to give each user the ability, or each page the ability to change it. Instead, you really want to have like a property bag or a setting that you want to put for your entire tenant. We can do that for SharePoint sites. We can do it for SharePoint lists and list items and collections. We've had that property bag for years. But what this is allowing us to do now is that we have the ability to have a property or a setting for an entire tenant, and that value would be accessible across the entire tenant. Now, the way this is going to work is that, and there's an article on in the documentation on the SharePoint Framework docs that explains how to use this. Instead of going through the code of this, just want to talk more about what this is. We're going to do more of an overview of kind of things today. The way it works is that you're going to manage the properties both in setting the values and maybe even deleting the values or creating and updating them. You're going to do this with PowerShell today. There is some work that's being done around some open source stuff or some community-based tools to do the same thing if you don't want to use PowerShell and you want to use something else. Like, for example, I'm a Mac guy. I don't have Windows. So PowerShell is not available to me. I know PowerShell is cross-platform, but the SharePoint and Office 365 stuff doesn't work so well that way. Or at least it doesn't for me. So what this is going to give us the ability to do, we'll have the ability then from this community stuff to be able to set these values. Now, the way you're going to get the value back, so let's say I build a web part, and another good example for this, let's say I want to put Google Analytics, or I want to put like say application insights on my SharePoint site, and I want to track all of the usage across my inside of application insights. Well, the way that both of those tools work, both those analytics tools work, is that they use an ID that's associated with your account, and that account is what's going to be where all the data is going to be stored. All the data is going to be tracked for all the custom events you may publish or page views and stuff like that. The way that it'll work is that you'll use an API call to the SharePoint REST API to get this value. It's a very simple call. anybody's going to be able to read this that has access to your SharePoint site. So if you're in the site and you make a call to the same site, it'll return back that value. So that way you could use that to say, I want to use one single application insights or one single Google Analytics account to track all utilization or all usage across all of my SharePoint in my tenant in Office 365. This would be a great way to do it, because you could just have that one, we call it a instrumentation key inside of Application Insights. We can set that Application Insights instrumentation key as a tenant property, and then we can access it from, say, using one of the new extensions with a application customizer that we've deployed to all of our SharePoint site collections and sites to be able to put the Application Insights JavaScript on the page. And to initialize it, we would just have a step that says, go get the instrumentation key from this tenant property. This is available today in people who are on the first release tenants. I know that there's a couple little bugs that they've actually found, and they're working through with this, or I've heard of a few things where people are having some issues on trying to get access to the properties. So they're working through this. Today it is in the first release tenants, or as we're going to see, first release is going to get renamed really soon to targeted release. So you can play with this today. So it's available today. Now, another thing that they talked about at the Ignite conference is around some work they've done around the Office UI Fabric, and kind of the timing was actually really good. Just 2 days ago, we saw this actually shipped. So what they've done, what Microsoft has done, is in the past, if you wanted to use any of the Office UI Fabric styles, the styles that you would end up using, all the styles that you had access to, were you really were using the styles that were coming from, like, say, the Fabric React controls or Fabric React components, not so much the core CSS. The core CSS had some conflicts, and you had issues trying to use that within your projects. What Microsoft has done with the latest version of the SharePoint framework, which shipped, I believe it was 2 days ago. So, like, I think it was October 31st. It might have been October 30th, but I think it was October 31st, if I'm not mistaken. It's version 1.3.4. So you want to get the latest version of the Yeoman generator. And there's an article at the bottom that actually explains this whole thing that I went and grabbed and pasted in. And of course, it's not rendering correctly. It rendered just great before the webinar, but it's kind of overlaying with that image. What they've done is they've made some changes to it to where now the Office UI Fabric core styles are now in all projects that you create from here on out. And you can upgrade your existing projects if you wanted to add it as well. So that's definitely an option that you can do. Makes it a little bit easier to go through and to use the styles if you don't want to use some of the Fabric React components. You just want to use some of the other stuff. This is not going to include everything in the Office UI Fabric core styles, but it includes most stuff, what they call the core stuff. So you want to go check the docs and make sure what is available to you or what is not available. Actually, the list of what's not available is very small. So go check and see what's not available and see if that's going to impact any of your plans. Okay, so that's all the stuff that we know is available today that we can play with today. Office UI Fabric core style support, that's in production right now. We can use that in all of our tenants. And then the other one was Tenant Properties, that's in first release. So let's look at some stuff that's coming down the pipe that we're going to be able to take advantage of. So with asset packaging, this is a new thing that we're going to get. So one of the things, if you know, with the SharePoint framework, when you deploy a SharePoint framework component, you have two different types of things you're going to deploy. You first have to deploy a SharePoint package to the app catalog, and that's got to be then installed, activated, and then installed in your SharePoint site collections and sites to be able to know about these resources. But again, all of our stuff we built with the SharePoint framework is all client-side stuff. It's all JavaScript. It's all potentially CSS. All of that stuff is going to go over to, is going to get deployed somewhere else. So the stuff we deploy to SharePoint is going to reference like a JavaScript file and a manifest file that live where Microsoft commonly tells us it's got to go in a CDN, and it doesn't really have to go in a CDN. It just has to go in a publicly accessible location. So we got to go through. We have to deploy this stuff to different different places, like a CDN, and it's kind of been a pain for developers, where you have to have this two-step kind of deployment, and it's kind of annoying. So one of the things that Microsoft is doing is that what they say, coming soon, and when I say coming soon, everything from here on out that I'm going to talk about in the rest of this webinar is stuff that they've implied is going to come to us by the end of the calendar year. Now, they weren't hard and fast with that date. We may see stuff coming. I think the way I look at it when I walked out of the room was it's coming at the end of the calendar year-ish. So it might be in November, it might be in December, we might see it in January, we might see it in February. The point is, this is coming, all this stuff is going to be coming really soon. What this is going to do, what the asset packaging is going to do, is it's going to give us the ability to include our assets for our components, the JavaScript, the manifest, stuff like that, CSS. All of that is going to be bundled inside, or include, I shouldn't use the term bundle. It's going to be included inside of our SharePoint package that we're going to deploy to SharePoint. And if we have a CDN, if we have the Office 365 CDN configured in our tenant, then that will it'll automatically deploy the files to the tenant or to the tenant CDN for us. So we won't have to worry about that extra step of deploying all of our different assets. Now, if you're like me, or I shouldn't say if you're like me, but if you're a developer, I guess this is the way I do it, and you choose to use Azure for your CDN, you don't want to use the Office 365 CDN, which under the covers it is an Azure-based CDN. But if you want a little more control over your CDN, which I prefer, and you want to use Azure, you're not going to use this. Right? You're still going to do it the way that we do it today. The only thing this is going to do is it's going to deploy it when it talks about deploying it to the tenant CDN. It's talking about deploying it to the tenant's Office 365 configured CDN, and that's the whole process of things that we have today, where we create a special document library and we then use PowerShell to configure our tenant to say, yes, we have a private or a public CDN. Here's the location. Here's the policy, etc. So this is coming. This will make life a little bit easier for some developers. Going forward. I do see a question that showed up here on Twitter that I wanted to address real quick from, I think it's Ruskov. So it's fun. The Twitter handle is Ruskov. And the question is, frankly, I don't know the answer to this off the top of my head. I'll see if I can't go find it while we're if we get to have a little bit extra time towards the end. But the question is, what's new with the list view threshold and predictive indexing? And I know that there's some stuff that's new, but frankly, off the top of my head, I'm blanking out on what it is. I wasn't planning on covering it today. I was focusing more on SharePoint framework stuff and not so much other SharePoint improvements. What I can say, Russ, is that if you go to the blog post that I referenced, I do point to one of the things that blog post does is it includes a bunch of links to different sessions that you might want to go take a look at. And one of the sessions was by a guy named Lincoln Damaris, who is he did a session related to improvements around lists and the modern UI and stuff like that. I know that what you're looking for is in his session. So if I can find it before we get off the webinar today, I'll try and find it. But if I can't, then that's a great place for you to go look and find where you can find the answer to your question. Okay, another thing that I want to cover here is something called site collection app catalogs. These we've been waiting for a while, and really there's nothing special about this. It's exactly what it sounds like. We have an app catalog today for the entire tenant, which means that if I package something up and send it over to my SharePoint framework, and I send it over to my app catalog and my tenant, then everybody in my entire tenant would potentially have access to whatever I just deployed in terms like a web part or whatever it was. But if you had a scenario where, let's say, the marketing department contracted someone to build a client-side web part, and they wanted that client-side web part to only be used inside the marketing department's site collections. Or let's say finance had something that was created and it really is only applicable to finance. It shouldn't show up on other communication sites or team sites for access. So what Microsoft is doing is they're creating another app catalog that will be only available to a site collection. So you'll be able to have, and this we don't have a ton of information on this yet because it was very much just a preview thing that they mentioned. But what I understand, and again, that may change because it's coming soon, we haven't seen it yet, but what we understand is that every site collection will have the ability to have its own app catalog. So I can then, instead of deploying things to the tenant app catalog, I can deploy them to the site collection app catalog, and then that resource or those, whatever is inside of that site collection app catalog would only be available to that site collection. So you can almost think of this, it's very similar to like the sandbox solution gallery we used to have, where whatever we deployed there was only available to that site collection and all the sites within that site collection. So of course the next question that's going to come up is someone's going to say, well, what if I have a web part and I want it available in 2 site collections, but not site collection C and D? Well, then you're going to deploy it twice. Once to site collection A, once to site collection B, then those people can use it. And you're like, well, I only want to deploy it once and make it available to both of them. Well, do it the tenant app catalog. And it's like, well, no, that's not what I want. And it's like, well, this is what we have. This looks like this is where our options are going to be. So it's at least an improvement going forward in terms of granularity on what we can do to have some control over where we're going to deploy stuff. All right. When is that coming? Well, I'm just going to say coming soon-ish. Again, that's one of our things that's coming later on this year. Okay, this one's huge. This one is really big, and this one is this is one that we've been harping on Microsoft for a while for. I was at the developer kitchen or the dev kitchen, which is a small event back in, I think it was March of this year, when they show some things that they're working on and they try and get a bunch of feedback from ISVs and people in the community and other people as well. What they end up doing is what they do with this is they kind of get feedback on where they're going with something and if this is the right direction. And this wasn't something that was really covered, but it was a big topic of discussion by a lot of us. We're trying to really push Microsoft to do something about this. And it looks like they've done it. Now we don't know exactly how this is implemented. There's a demo at one of the sessions from the SharePoint Ignite conference by Luca Bandinelli. Again, that blog post I have has a good reference to the video, and there's the demo at the very end. And I think I even have the time code to let you jump straight to it on YouTube. But the demo at the very end will demonstrate this happening. So what this is let's first look at what the problem is and what this is doing to address it. So first, today, if I want to call, if I write let's say a client-side web part, and really anything in the SharePoint framework this applies to anything. We're just gonna say a client-side web part. If I want to build a web part and I want that web part to read and write data from a SharePoint list, no problem. I have something called the SP HTTP client, and I can work with that. What if I want to work with a Microsoft Graph? Well, we have something called the Graph HTTP client, which is technically in preview right now, but Microsoft is doing a bunch of work to get that polished up and shipped. That's one of the things, I don't have it in my slides, but that's one of the things that's supposed to be shipping in the next few months. Well, what if I want to call a third-party API? Let's say I create some server-side thing that I wanted, or some other web service somewhere that needs to do some work. And there's a lot of different scenarios of when you'd want to do this. Like, let's say, for example, that I wanted to write some server-side code. I don't want to write it all in JavaScript, some complex logic, and store some stuff in an external database. Well, I may go write a website and store it in an Azure web app, or I may use an Azure function to do that. That's calling a third-party web service. And that's just to call that, I would call the HTTP client. But the challenge that we have is that I can't call that third-party service in a very secure. Let's see. I can't query that third-party service in a first, a very secure way, and B, if it was secure, it wasn't a very user-friendly experience. And the reason for that is that I'm going across domains, and by going across domains, I would lose I'd lose the authentication context. So whenever someone was going to call that third-party service, they would have to log in again, and that's not a good experience. You may be able to get away with like single sign-on and stuff like that, but generally speaking, it's not a good experience. So we're in this position now, and you may ask me, well, why would I need to authenticate? Why do I need to secure that service? Well, I mean, of course, there's lots of different reasons, but let me give you a really common one. I want to impersonate somebody, or I want to elevate the permissions. So what I would do is like I would say, let's go create a. I want to go have some sort of a third-party service is going to call a. I want that to call back to SharePoint using the REST API. I want it to authenticate as an app and have app-only permissions and create a brand new list because the current user doesn't have access to do that. I can't do that in the SharePoint framework today. So I need to do that in an external service because everything that runs in the SharePoint framework runs client-side, and you can't impersonate somebody client-side. That's not just a SharePoint framework thing. That's just in general, you can't do that. So I'd want to do that using server-side code in a very secure way. And so I would want to secure that service because I don't want just anybody hitting that. I really want to lock it down to have only a specific, either a specific person or a specific set of people that have that ability. So what Microsoft is doing is they're setting up some infrastructure. They're implementing some infrastructure that's going to allow me, let me first explain to you what they're doing, and then I'll explain kind of how they're doing it and how it'll work. What they're doing is that it's going to allow me to build something with the SharePoint framework to effectively call SharePoint or use the Microsoft Graph to say, I want you to go call my third-party web service that's as an Azure function, or it could be anywhere, but I want to call this third-party web service that lives in some external service on my behalf and then return the data back to me. So you're effectively, if you did add-in development, this smells a lot like those remote URLs that we had the ability to do. You could basically ask SharePoint, hey, do me a favor and go make a call to that other service for me on my behalf and then give me the response back. Now the way this will work is that tenant administrators are the only ones that are going to be able to do this, are going to be able to set this up. So not everybody can set this up because clearly you're opening up a hole or you're opening up a capability that could be used the wrong way. So we don't want to let users have the ability to do this, or site collection owners. So a tenant administrator, what they would do is they would go in and they would have access to all the scopes and the web APIs that would have access to call the different service. So the way I understand this, and again, we don't have any documentation on it, so it was just one session at a conference. It was I talked to Luca a little bit afterwards. I don't fully understand everything they're doing. We're still trying to figure this out, and it's still really early on, and frankly, as you'll see if you watch the demo that Luca did, they weren't even confident that the demo was going to work. There was a lot of, kind of, hey, this might not work. We'll see if it works. And you should have seen like the video. There's no video of like them on stage, but you should have seen the video of when he actually got this working. The sense of relief that he had was like, oh my God, it actually worked. So my understanding of the way this is going to work is that let's say if I have an Azure function, my Azure function is going to have an Azure. It has to trust that SharePoint or the graph is going to be calling it, and the only way that that can be initiated is from the SharePoint framework and from SharePoint. So effectively, I'm not going to be my web service that I create is not. It may have its own identity. It might not. I'm not that part. I'm not entirely sure about. It might have its own permissions, its own scopes. It might not. But I would then say that the graph has the ability to call that application with these permissions. What we also don't know, which I'm trying to find out, is will the context of the current user, the identity of the current user that initiated this from their SharePoint Framework component, will that also be included in what's sent over to my web service? And see, when I do this, I'll be able to write my web service in a way that says, I'm only going to trust calls coming from Microsoft. You can't just make some third-party call, using something like, say, Postman. I won't respond to that. And I have to have a certain level of trust that says, if the call is coming from Graph, and if Graph says it was initiated by John Doe, then I'm going to trust it that it was really John Doe asking this. And so then I can then go in and do like some impersonation or whatever and do whatever I want to do, whatever I can do with custom code, right? So this is a pretty big feature that's being added here. This is it's one thing that does open up. It's one of those, hey, with great responsibility, or with great power comes great responsibility. This should be used wisely, but I can see it being incredibly useful to us. We just have to see, how they implement it, how this is going to work. We don't know yet. We've seen a demo and we've seen a couple slides on it, but that's it. So we can expect to see a lot more of this, hopefully coming soon. As we know more about this, you can bet that I'll be writing about it. Okay. Let's see. Just check Twitter real quick. I don't see any questions, and yeah. Okay. So let's switch on to the next thing. I have 2 more things to cover here. So if you guys got any questions, we got looks like about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. So you feel free to post questions to Twitter using the hashtag LTSPFX, or to raise your hand, and Brett will let me know and collect the questions from you, and we can do a couple questions. Well, I should have some time for that at the end. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to get, and this one I think we're getting really soon, but we're getting ALM APIs for SharePoint Framework Solutions and add-ins. Oh, finally, right? It's only 4 years late. So what this is that today, or really even since we had add-ins, we've not had a way to programmatically deploy, upgrade, etc., and do all that stuff with our things that we deploy to SharePoint. We've always had to take the package, upload it to the app catalog. We have to go through a little process of checking off that, yes, we trust it, blah, blah. And let's say we roll it out to 1,000 people or 1,000 different sites, and then we say, oh, shoot, there's a calculation error. We have to go update our web part. And we update the code base, and then all those places, we have to go back and we have to start updating that code base. And someone says, well, what's the solution? And just like they said during the presentation at Ignite, it's like, well, start clicking. There's not a whole lot of options that you have available here until this comes out. So what they're doing is they're giving us ALM APIs for SharePoint Framework Solutions, and that's going to give us the ability to programmatically manage and deploy SharePoint Framework Solutions and add-ins from a tenant app catalog. Now, I find that to be a little interesting. They call out a tenant app catalog, but what about site collection app catalogs when those come in? Will we be able to use those in there as well? I don't know. We'll see. What this will allow us to do is to allow us to automate the deployment of our customizations across the tenant. So let's say, for instance, today, there are ways that I can do this today. I can use some of the PnP PowerShell stuff to do certain things. Like, for example, if I built let's go back to the example I used earlier. If I have a SharePoint Framework extension that is going to use an application customizer to put app insights on every single site in my SharePoint tenant, then what's going to happen with that is that I would have to write a significant amount of PowerShell to, once I've installed the app in the app catalog, once I've deployed it to the app catalog, or so I've deployed the customization to the app catalog, I would then have to enumerate through all of my sites using PowerShell and then add that extension to each one of them, which is really messy. The code to do that, or the PowerShell to do that, is quite long. I mean, I think I've done that once or twice, and I think it was somewhere around like 70 some odd lines. But it's boilerplate stuff. It's not that bad, but it's just something we shouldn't have to do. So they're giving us these ALM APIs that should allow us to upgrade, install, uninstall, I think activate or add the app to the site collections, as well as upgrade. And I'm curious to see if we get things like also, if it's not just actions, but if we get like queries as well, so we can see like, where is this app that hasn't been, where is this customization been deployed? And I can see a list of everywhere it's been deployed, and then I can see like the versions that are deployed in those different instances. We haven't seen this just yet. This is coming soon. If you want to see a little bit of a preview to it, though, if you go look at some of the developer branches and the PMP PowerShell stuff, I've seen some code in those repos that looks like they've already started working on some code around that to address the different APIs. So even though the APIs aren't quote unquote even published or even available in first release, or I don't know where, they may only be in canary tenants, but you can see how some people are starting to consume those things. So I know that some of the PMP guys will probably have canary tenants where they can go build stuff ahead of time. So we'll see. So this is going to be a very welcomed addition. I just had a discussion with somebody about this earlier this week, where they had some challenges around. They were looking to build something to go through and to roll out a web part to tons and tons of different places, and I was like, well, right now you got to start clicking. But if I were you, I wouldn't invest too much time in it just yet. I would wait and see until we have a little bit more information about these. Okay. So this next thing here is my last thing I want to cover, and then we can start doing some questions. This one might open up a lot of questions though. This next thing was not part of Ignite. This is not coming from Microsoft. Frankly, Microsoft can't do anything with this. This is coming from another vendor. I guess you can call them a vendor, but this is a very, very popular question that we get as SharePoint Framework developers, and that is, how can I use Angular inside the SharePoint framework? So let's level set some stuff. Let's make sure you understand what I'm talking about here, and then let me give you a little bit of a preview-ish kind of a thing. I haven't talked about this stuff anywhere yet, like publicly yet, and I'm going to be a little cagey about some of the stuff that I say because I don't want to steal somebody's thunder. But let me give you a little hint on what's going on. So first of all, if you want to use today, when you build something in the SharePoint framework, Microsoft is really going to, they don't tell you you have to use it. They say you can use any framework you want, but I mean, let's be real. They really are pushing you in the React direction. They have Office UI Fabric is done as React components. We call those Fabric React. You can use those in your projects. That's all fine and good. But there's a lot of people who have invested a lot of time to learn Angular, using Angular in other projects, and they're having a hard time using it inside of SharePoint Framework today. Or you might be like me and you just absolutely hate React, but that's different. So first of all, you have to make sure you understand the Angular versioning story. In the Angular versioning story, you have AngularJS, and that's Angular version 1.x. So it's anything prior to version 2. And then late last year or 2 years ago, they came out, actually, I blank on when it was, but a little bit ago, they came out with a new version of Angular, which is totally different, that was called Angular 2. Well, after that, they then kind of reset their naming and their versioning scheme, and they went to a model where Angular was going to, it's a similar release schedule and versioning schedule that what companies like Docker and Node.js and a lot of other companies, these more open source kind of companies, on how they do stuff and how they release stuff. And they use a system of versioning called SEMVer. It's a semantic versioning. And when they did that, what you effectively do is not only the versioning actually has meaning to it, but not only does it have meaning to it, but it also has a what do you call it? They also added a schedule to it. So what the Angular guys have done is they've said, okay, we are now going to ship a major release every 6 months. Same thing like what Docker does. Same thing what Node.js does. We're going to ship a major release every 6 months. So Angular 4 came out earlier this year, I think around March, somewhere around there. Maybe it was February, maybe it was April, somewhere around there, right at the end of the first quarter. And actually just yesterday, Angular 5 came out. Now, if you're an Angular developer, don't start getting Angular versioning fatigue, because when you look at what's different between Angular 1 and between Angular 2 and Angular 4, it's minimal. It's like they added an else statement to the if directive. They added a couple new things to the for loop so that I could say, or to the for loop, to where I could say what was the first item, the last item, is the current item an odd number in the collection or an even number. It's extra stuff, but it's not like, oh my God, I've got to upgrade my app. All right. From what I've seen so far with Angular 5, same deal. They've done some stuff to make the payload, the size of Angular much smaller, and they've done a bunch of stuff to make things a much better experience. Okay, so that's just a versioning thing. All right, just in case you weren't aware of that. So today, what's the problem with Angular, using Angular today inside the SharePoint framework? Well, when they built Angular 2, and this is true for every version since then, we call it just Angular now. So we dropped the JS, that means Angular 2 and higher. So Angular 2, Angular 4, Angular 5. And if you're wondering, what's up with Angular 3, I have a blog post that I put out about 2 or 3 days ago that you can go take a look at on my site, just andrewconnell.com, that explains why there's no 3, and it's kind of funny, but it's not important. If you want to use Angular today inside the SharePoint framework, the challenge that we have with it has nothing to do with Microsoft. So all these questions that I see people posting in like the issues list and the request to Microsoft, support Angular 4, there is absolutely nothing Microsoft can do here, okay? The challenge is an architectural decision by the Angular team at Google on why it doesn't work. And the reason they did it is because Angular 2 has the assumption that we own the page. As a developer, I own the page and I own everything on the page. In doing so, for performance reasons, we have one single top-level component on the page, and everything that is Angular and is under that one component. So it ends up being a giant component tree. We can't do that in SharePoint. Well, we can, but we can't do it cleanly. I can't build a web part and deploy and give it to one of you and have you, I can't give it to Lightning Tools and have Lightning Tools deploy it on their intranet, their SharePoint intranet. And then Brett at Lightning Tools goes and builds another Angular 4 web part, and he wants to deploy it to Lightning Tools intranet. Mine's going to work just fine, and then when Brett deploys his and he puts it on the page, then neither one of us are going to work well. And the reason why is because now there's no one single component. There's 2 components that are sitting at parallel, and Angular is expecting 1. So there is a way around this. There's a guy by the name, I'm gonna mess the name up. I do it every time. But Sebastian Levert, he's from Valo, but he's got a really cool solution where he dynamically creates a top-level component, and we build our web parts to just have some knowledge that, oh, I need to add my web part to the top-level component that's on the page. If it's not there, then I need to create one and add it to it. The challenge with that approach is that you can't do some code optimization stuff to shrink the payload down. If you've done stuff with Angular, you know that there's something called ahead of time compilation or AOT and tree shaking. Those depend on static code analysis. And if we're dynamically generating code, then there's no such thing as static code. So they don't work. And what it ends up being is that Brett and I could do that. I could build a web part. He could build a web part. We both deploy it to the site. We could get 2 Angular 4 web parts working, but they're each going to be like 700K to 1 meg. And that's just not a good story. What you're going to see, though, is a concept that the Angular team has been working on called Angular Elements. I'm saying here on the slide that it's Angular 5 plus Angular Elements. I don't know exactly how the packaging is going to work. I don't know if it's going to require Angular 5. I think it will. I don't know if it's going to be part of Angular 5. So far, I don't think so. But regardless, the way it's essentially going to work is that you're going to use Angular to author your component, and then when you compile it, it simply compiles down to a web component. So What does that mean? Well, a web component is just like a custom component. So just like we have in the HTML DOM, we have things like block quote and bold and table. Web components allow me to build my own custom thing. So I could have something like, say, the Lightning Tools data view or something like that, a component like that I wanted to drop on the page. It would just be a new HTML tag. It has nothing to do with Angular. It's just an HTML thing. It's supported by all the major browsers except for Edge. Edge is still investigating it, but they're getting there. They're going to do it. It's just taking them longer than everybody else. Go figure, there's Edge. But what they're going to do, what it does is that you add a single JavaScript file to the page, which is your generated component, and then a single line of JavaScript, which basically registers with the DOM saying, here's a new component, here's the class that's associated with it, and here's how you can use it on the page. So that I can do open bracket, Lightning Tools dash data view, close bracket, and I have my component get rendered. It can have custom properties as inputs. It can emit events. It can respond to events that you can attach. Frankly, it's a beautiful solution. What's so cool about this is that this is going to be the silver bullet to get Angular working inside the SharePoint framework. I've seen these things work. In fact, I was just at Google working with them on this for some time last week over in California. I've seen some pieces. I've seen like a progress bar implementation. I've seen that work. I've seen it work, full-blown work in 40K on a page. I love it. I'm an Angular fan, and I'm a really big fan of Angular Elements. In fact, I might even be a bigger fan of Angular Elements. What's cool about this is you don't have to deal with all the extra stuff that Angular brings to the table if I'm not using it. I don't need all the dependency injection and the routing and all that stuff. If I want it, then I get to keep it, and I get to keep using it inside of Angular Elements. But if I don't need it, then I don't need it. I just need the component. So you effectively are using Angular as a developer, but you're generating JavaScript. It's the same thing as I'm using TypeScript to generate JavaScript components. So where can you learn more about this? Well, today, there's not a whole lot of information out there. I'm just sharing this to you for the first time, and really it's the first time I've talked about it, so I'm curious to know what you guys think about this, because once this comes out, I'm gonna do some stuff around it as well. What you want to do is go look up, I think Google's got the best documentation on this, so if you go to the Google Web Developer Docs, go look up web components. It's nothing to do with Google, it's got nothing to do with Chrome, but it's just an HTML thing, but they do a really good job of explaining it. And then the other thing is that if you're going to the European SharePoint conference in Dublin, I think that's in like 2 weeks or so, make sure you pay attention to the sessions that are there. There's a guy from Google that's going to be there presenting, and I think he's going to show this for the very first time. So it's going to be really, really exciting. Definitely take a look at it. I think he's going to come on the podcast, on my podcast as well. We'll talk to him about it, and you just expect to see a lot of stuff about this. So this is really exciting if you're an Angular developer, or if you're just interested in seeing cool stuff. So this will be a lot of fun. All right, so with that, that's everything I wanted to cover today. I do see another question here on that came in through Twitter, so I'm going to go ahead and answer that one in just a second. But before I do that, if anybody has any other questions, now's a good time to put them in. We got a little under 10 minutes to go through questions. This whole webinar is being recorded. It will be available to watch some point tomorrow, maybe sooner, but let's just count on tomorrow. And yeah, I've got a couple free resources there. If you're interested, just go head over to my site, voitanos.io, where you can sign up for either my Mastering the SharePoint Framework course or my 10-day email course as well. And so I hope you guys got a lot out of this, and you enjoyed the webinar. So let me go back to Twitter real quick, answer a question here. This one is by Joss. I hope I got that right. So Joss says, is there an advantage of deploying solutions through code over the interface? So my understanding is that the question you're asking is would it be better for me to, is there any advantage to deploying something custom that I build using these new ALM APIs that are coming out versus just doing it through the web browser? The only thing that you're getting by doing it through the API is the only way you get it by doing it through the API is let's see, is being able to do it for a lot of items at once, or to automate it. In terms of like if I had one component that I was deploying to one site collection, if I do it through the browser or I do it through the APIs, there's no benefit, there's no difference. They're all the exact same. If I do it, there's nothing new, there's nothing really to gain. And in fact, I would probably use the web interface because you're going to do it a lot faster. Otherwise, you're going to have to write code just to deploy your stuff, when that's just a lot of extra work. However, if I've got to deploy that web component, or that component that I just built, that client-side web part, if I have to deploy it to 100 sites, it's going to probably save me a lot of time to write a little bit of code and use the APIs to deploy that thing to 100 sites, instead of uploading it to the app catalog and then going to 100 different sites, creating a new instance of it and installing it that way. So the advantage here is just automation, really. It's just that using the API allows us to automate deployment, upgrade, classic application lifecycle stuff, ALM stuff. So that's the only advantage. There's no benefit to the features or anything like that. I personally prefer the ALM approach, using more ALM APIs to do this stuff, because I think that deployment should always be something that should be scripted and not a manual process, because it's less error prone. Plus, if it's scripted using APIs, it's essentially self-documenting how to go through and deploy stuff. And as us developers, that means we don't have to talk to the IT pros, which is always a good thing, right? I'm joking. I mean, not really, but I am, but not really. All right, so next question is by John Stauffer. So John says, is there any insight into using SharePoint Framework to control master pages and other menu type and common layout items in the modern experience? So we could go into a lot of different directions with this one, but today, so customizing a master page, that I would treat that as like past tense. We don't do that anymore. There's nothing a SharePoint Framework is going to do to allow us to customize the master page, and we're really kind of out of the master page customization business with SharePoint. I get that people want to still do that. They want to have those same capabilities, but this is just my 2 cents, my opinion here. Clearly, Microsoft doesn't want us to do that. Clearly, they are trying to give us the ability to have a specific, or have a hosted service, and give us places to do our own customizations to it, like adding menu buttons, like which we can do. We can add new buttons to the context menus on list items and document libraries. And we can do that using SharePoint Framework extensions, and I think they're called command sets. But we're not going to do things, and we can also change like the theme and the coloring and stuff like that. But they don't want us changing the layout of the site anymore. If you do that, to me, you're just trying to swim upstream. I mean, you're going to run into problems with that. Eventually, if you get it working, Microsoft is going to release a new update to it. It's going to break all your stuff. It's just not how the product works anymore. And the biggest challenge we have is that we all have the baggage of being able to do that in the past, and we can't get it out of our head. You can't do that kind of stuff with a hosted service like Salesforce, or a hosted service like, I don't know, Google Docs, right? Or OneDrive. You can't make those kind of customizations anymore. And I think that we're just kind of past that point. So unfortunately, we just don't have that ability. So the other question that you had there, John, was about common layout items in the modern experience. We do have the ability to have multiple columns now, which is essentially multiple columns. Each column is a canvas, and then we can add different things to that canvas. That's the biggest change that they've ended up giving us. The one thing I think that we really would like is a full page app experience, to where we can deploy, like, say, a single page app. So I could build a real application and have it hosted inside of SharePoint as a single page app, as a client-side app that may talk to third-party web services. We are still waiting for that. That's not available to us today. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in through Twitter right now. We got about 3 minutes left. Yeah, so I got about 2 or 3 minutes left. I'll give it another minute or so for anybody to submit any other questions coming in here. But I believe I've gone through all the questions that I've received. I hope you guys have gotten something out of this. I hope this was valuable to you. Again, all those things, just as a little recap, the things that Microsoft has released or mentioned at the Ignite conference that have since been released are the tenant properties. Those are available in first release tenants today. And then the support for the Office UI Fabric core styles. If you want information about that, if you go to the docs or go to dev.office.com/blogs, they had a blog post out about that the other day. And then the stuff that's coming soon, we had asset packaging, where they'll deploy our assets and our SharePoint Framework components to the Office CDN. We have a site collection app catalogs are coming to where we can scope the deployment a little bit more than we have in the past. We have the ability to call third-party or custom web APIs. They call them web APIs. I gave them feedback that they should stop calling them that. They're just REST endpoints. That's all they are. Web API is more of a product from Microsoft, but it's just a marketing term. Anyway, ALM APIs, those are coming as well. I think that those are coming really soon. I don't have any special insight into when those are coming, but my guess is that we'll see those in the next month or so. And then the last thing I talked about was just to take advantage of the fact that we had a little extra time and talk a little bit about Angular 5 and SharePoint Framework stuff coming. So last question here, I see that just came in. Well, unfortunately, last question not ending on the best of notes. Before we stop here, this is from Rich, and Rich is asking, is anything coming down the pipe regarding updates to the publishing framework? Not that I'm aware of. Sorry. So kind of a wah-wah to end it. My bad. Not really my bad. I'm just the messenger on this one. I haven't seen anything. I haven't seen them invest anything there. I think that, from what I see really from SharePoint is they kind of went out of the publishing experience, and they're trying to push people more into just the pure collaborative, embracing their collaborative roots with things like communication sites and stuff like that. I think that's really what they want to do in terms of collaboration or in terms of publishing. Cool. So that's all the questions. If you guys have any other questions, I'll keep an eye on Twitter. If you use that same hashtag there, I'll try to answer any questions that do come up later on today or come up in the next few minutes. But with that, on behalf of Lightning Tools, I really want to thank everybody for giving us a little bit of your time, and I'm also thanking Lightning Tools for hosting this webinar today. So thank you guys very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.